Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to show you how to install vCenter Server 5.5 on Windows Server using the simple install method. I assume that you already know what a vCenter Server is and what it is used for. Alright, a vCenter Server 5.5 can be installed using two methods. The first method is to use the simple install method, which will install the vCenter server and all of its components such as vCenter Single Signon, vSphere Web Client, vCenter Inventory Service, and vCenter Server automatically on the same host. The second method is to use the custom install method, which is used to customize the location and setup of each component and to install the components separately on a different machine. For example, I can have a dedicated machine for vCenter Server, another machine for vCenter Single Sign-On, another one for vSphere Web Client. And if I'm going to use the custom install method, I need to install the components in the specific order. The first one, I should install the vCenter Single Sign-On, and then vSphere Web Client, and then vCenter Inventory Service, and finally vCenter Server. But in my case, in this video, I'm going to install vCenter Server and all of its components on the same machine using the simple install option. And moreover, simple install is appropriate for most deployments. And I assume that you are doing a fresh installation of vCenter Server. This video does not talk about upgrading the vCenter Server from 5.1 to vCenter Server 5.5. And if you have a vCenter database that you want to preserve, you should not perform a fresh installation of vCenter Server because it's going to wipe out the entire database that you already have. So first, let me talk about prerequisites for installing vCenter Server 5.5. Alright, the first thing that we have to do is prepare the vCenter Server database. vCenter Server requires database to store and organize server data, and each vCenter Server instance must have its own database. So for small installations up to 5 hosts and 50 virtual machines, you can use the bundled Microsoft SQL Server 2008 Express database, which will be created during the vCenter Server installation. For larger installations, it is required to have a supported database such as Microsoft SQL Server or Oracle, and it is also recommended to have a dedicated database server in a large environment, and if possible to set up the high availability for your database servers. In my case, I really don't need to prepare the vCenter Server database because I'm going to use the bundled Microsoft SQL Server 2008 Express database, which will automatically configure the database for us. Moreover, the Microsoft SQL 2008 Express database will be installed on the same server where we are going to install the vCenter Server as well. So this way, our setup will be simplified. But if I had to use a dedicated database server, then I had to configure the roles and permissions for the database before installing the vCenter Server. Alright, let me talk about the system prerequisites. First, you can install vCenter Server on a physical machine or on a virtual machine running on an ESXi host. And in my case, I'm going to install the vCenter Server on a virtual machine. And you cannot install vCenter Server on a network drive or on a USB flash drive. vCenter Server 5.5 requires a 64-bit operating system, and vCenter Server 5.5 removed the support for the Windows Server 2003 and Windows Server 2008 SP1 as a host operating system. So if you have Windows Server 2008 SP1 hosts, you have to upgrade it to SP2 before installing vCenter Server 5.5. And you have to make sure that your vCenter server is configured with the static IP address and the FQDN, that is the host name, registered in DNS. Before you install or upgrade any vSphere product, it is recommended that you synchronize the clocks of all machines on the vSphere network. And you got to verify that the host name of the machine that you're installing vCenter server on complies with RFC 952 guidelines. And the installation path of the vCenter server must be compatible with the installation requirements for Microsoft Active Directory application mode, which is ATOM, or in Windows Server 2008 it is called Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services, ADLDS. And the installation path should not contain non-ASCII characters, commas, periods, exclamation points, pound, at, or percentage signs. Alright, moving on, you have to verify that the system on which you are installing vCenter server is not an Active Directory domain controller. You have to make sure that your vCenter server is joined to the domain as a member server. And my vCenter server is already joined to the domain. And on each system that is running vCenter server, you have to verify that the domain user account has the following permissions. So it has to be the member of the administrators group. It needs to have the permission to act as part of the operating system, and it needs to have the permission to log on as a service. In my case, I'll be logging into the vCenter server as a domain admin. And you got to verify that no network address translation, that is NAT, exists between vCenter server system and the hosts it'll manage. And finally, the vCenter server 5.5 supports connection between vCenter server and the components only by IPv4 addressing. So if you have an IPv6 environment, you should use the FQDN, that is the host name of the vCenter server. So let's move on to the software prerequisites. So first one, vCenter server requires the Microsoft .NET 3.5 SP1 framework to be installed. If it is not installed on your system, the vCenter server installer installs it. And if you plan to use the Microsoft SQL Server 2008 R2 Express database that is bundled with vCenter server, you need to install MSI 4.5. And you can download MSI 4.5 from the Microsoft website, or you can install the MSI 4.5 directly from the vCenter server installer. Before we install the vCenter server and all of its components on the same machine, our vCenter server host machine must meet the following minimum hardware requirements. So coming to the processor, we should have a 64-bit processor, either Intel or AMD, and it should have 2 or more logical cores, and each core should have at least a speed of 2 gigahertz. So moving on to the memory, we need to have 12 GB. You may need to have more memory if vCenter server and its database runs on the same server. Coming to the JVM heap settings, vCenter server, it includes several Java services such as VMware Virtual Center Management Web Services, Inventory Service, and Profile-Driven Storage Service. So when you install vCenter server, you select the size of your vCenter server inventory to allocate memory for these services. And these services determines the maximum JVM heap settings for these services. You can adjust these settings after installation if number of hosts in your environment changes. So if you have a small inventory of 1 to 100 hosts and 1 to 1000 virtual machines. For VMware Virtual Center Management Web Services, you need 1 GB. For inventory service, you need 2 GB. For profile driven storage service, you need 3 GB. If you have a medium inventory, you need 2 GB for VMware Virtual Center Management Web Services. You need 6 GB for inventory service. You need 2 GB for profile driven storage service. And for larger inventory, you need 3 GB for VMware Virtual Center Management Web Services, 12 GB for inventory service, 4 GB for profile driven storage service. So these options can be selected during the installation of vCenter server, or it can be specified later. Alright, let's talk about disk storage. So you need 100 GB, which is recommended. 40 to 60 GB of free disk space is required after installation of vCenter server, depending on the size of your inventory. You should also consider more space to allow for future growth of your inventory, and the disk storage requirements are higher if the vCenter server database runs on the same machine as vCenter server. And again, it depends on the size of your database. And in vCenter 5 series, the default size for vCenter server logs is 450 MB. So you need to allocate more space to log folder for future increase. And for the network speed, 1 gigabit per second is recommended. Alright, let's talk about the required ports that needs to be open for vCenter Server 5.5. So vCenter Server must be able to send data to every managed hosts and receive data from every vSphere web client. So to enable migration and provisioning activities between managed hosts, the source and destination hosts must be able to receive data from each other. So if you have a firewall that exists between any of these elements, and if Windows Firewall service is in use, the installer, it will open the ports that are required for vCenter Server 5.5 during the installation. But if you have any other firewalls, you must manually open the required ports. So these are the required ports, and in my case, I'm not using any firewall on any host. So let me talk about how you can download the vCenter Server installer. So you can download the vCenter Server, the vSphere web client, and associated vCenter components and support tools from VMware downloads page, which is www.vmware.com/downloads. Alright, we're going to do a demo, and I've already downloaded the vCenter Server installation ISO file, burned it on a DVD, and I've also mounted the DVD on my vCenter server. So I'm going to show you the step-by-step installation of vCenter server using the simple install method. Alright, I've already logged into my vCenter server as a domain admin. I've made sure that my vCenter server meets all the system software and hardware prerequisites. So I'm going to go into computer and right click on the DVD drive, and I'll click on install or run program from your media, and it will open the vCenter server installer screen. As we are going to perform simple installation of vCenter server, we should click on simple install, which is already selected. So I'm going to click on the install button to continue. Okay, on the welcome screen, we'll click next to continue. I'll click on I accept the terms in the license agreement, and I click next. Now the wizard will test if the DNS resolution is successful or not, and if the machine is joined to the domain or not. In my case, the test is successful, so I'll click next. Now you need to set the password for vCenter Single Sign-On administrator account. This is the password for the user administrator at vsphere.local. And vsphere.local is a new domain that will be created by vCenter Single Sign-On. And after the installation, you can log into vCenter Single Sign-On and into vCenter Server as administrator at vsphere.local. And by the way, the password must have at least 8 characters and at least one lowercase, one uppercase, one number, and one special character. Non-ASCII characters, semicolon, double quotation mark, single quotation mark, circumflex, and backslash are not supported in password. So I'm going to set a password as per the password policy, and I'm going to confirm it again. I'll click next. Now you can enter a site name for vCenter Single Sign-On. You can choose your own name for the vCenter Single Sign-On site, but I'm going to change the site name to my Active Directory site name, which is Life Music Tech. So I'll click next. Now you can accept or change the HTTPS port number for vCenter Single Sign-On. I'm okay with this port number, so I'm going to click next. And now you can select the installation folder in which to install the vCenter Single Sign-On. We'll accept the defaults and click next. Alright, you can review the installation options for vCenter Single Sign-On and click install. So I'm going to click install. Now the vCenter Single Sign-On installation begins. Alright, so when the vCenter Single Sign-On installation is complete, the installer proceeds with the vSphere web client and vCenter inventory service installations. So all of these components will be installed automatically because we have selected simple install method. So if you are using Windows Server 2012 on your vCenter server, the installer uses scripts to install each component of vCenter server. So when it prompts you to stop the script to run, you have to click on no. So if you click no, the installation will continue. Otherwise, it will stop the installation. And after each component is installed, the installer might take a few minutes to start the installation for the next component. So just wait for some time for things to happen. So now you can see that the installer is installing VMware vSphere web client. Alright, the vSphere web client has been installed successfully. Now I'm going to click no to run the script for the installation of vCenter inventory service. And in a simple install option, the installer will install the single sign-on first, and then web client, and then inventory service, and finally it will start the vCenter server installation. Okay, I'm going to click no to run the script to start vCenter server installation. Alright, now you can type in your license key for vCenter Server 5.5, and if you don't type the license key, vCenter Server will be installed in evaluation mode for a 60-day evaluation period. You can also enter the license key after the installation of vCenter Server, but in my case I'll run the vCenter Server in evaluation mode, so I'm going to click next. So now you can choose the type of database that you want to use. So to use the bundle database, you have to select install a Microsoft SQL Server 2008 Express instance. This is for small scale deployments. And this type of database is suitable for deployments of up to 5 hosts and 50 virtual machines. But if you want to use an existing database, you got to click on use an existing supported database, and you have to specify the data source name and that should be 64-bit. But in my case, my deployment size is very small, so I'm going to use the bundle database, and I'll click next. You can run the database using a local system account or another administrative user service account, but I'll keep the default selections and I'll click next. Now it will show the port numbers for each components that you install. So you can accept the default port numbers, or if another service is using the default, you can enter another port number. So I'm okay with the default port selection, and I'll click next. Now you can select the size of your vCenter server inventory to allocate memory for several Java services that are used by vCenter server. Like I said in the slides, this setting determines the maximum JVM heap settings for VMware Virtual Center Management Web Services, Inventory Service, and Profile Driven Storage Service. So you can adjust this setting after the installation if the number of hosts in your environment changes. But my inventory size is very small, so which is already selected. So I'm going to click on next. All right, if you want, you can review the changes by clicking back. So now the wizard is ready to install the vCenter server. So I'm going to click on install. Now it's going to take some time for the installation to complete. So you can see that the installer is installing the SQL Server 2008 R2 Express database. Okay, now you can see that the wizard has successfully installed the vCenter server. So I'm going to click on finish. All right, so you can see here that vCenter Single Signon, vSphere Web Client, vCenter Inventory Service, and vCenter Server have been installed successfully. So I'm going to click on OK. Okay, so this is how you install vCenter Server using simple install method. Thanks for watching the video. For more videos, please subscribe to my channel.